Welcome. We'll get started. Welcome. I'm glad that you could join us today. And we're going to do a little session on sharing Indigenous stories. My name's Robert DeRoche. I am Métis from Ontario and French. I am the centrally assigned Vice Principal, Indigenous Education at the Urban Indigenous Education Centre.
Hi everyone, my name is Adrienne Plumley. I'm Mi'kmaq, Métis, Scottish, and Welsh, and I am one of the instructional leaders at the Urban Indigenous Education Centre.
So the TDSB, this is our land acknowledgement we use. We acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And so I like to add to this a bit. I like to think about my own connection, because I live close to Broadview and Danforth, the Don River that feeds into Lake Ontario. So I think about my own responsibilities to keep the land, air, and water clean for future generations. And as well, because this is not my traditional territory, and so I need to be respectful of that. And so this is when doing the land acknowledgement, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, EDFO, has put out this fantastic document, starting from the heart, going beyond the land acknowledgement. And what it is it's activities, it's a lot of learning for adults to think about themselves and go about land acknowledgements, but there's great activities to do with students from kindergarten to grade 12 and thinking about their connection to land and land acknowledgements. And so, for example, I want you to think about this is, in what ways do you use the land? Think of the many ways the land provides for you daily. So from the moment you get up until you go back to bed, how does it make you feel? What does it do for your mind, your body, and your spirit? But also, how do you show appreciation for the land? So I want you to think about this for a moment, about your own connection to the land and how you show appreciation for the land. And if you wouldn't mind maybe just typing a word or two into the chat, that would be appreciated. Connection to nature. The land brings me healing and peace, especially the water. Always drawn to the water no matter where I go. Well, I suppose presenting some information to my students. The water walk, yes. So that's great, but I always want us to think about our own connection to the land. It is important to engage in those conversations with students, but we also need to think about ourselves too. So let's move on to the next one. Thank you.
So at this session today, we've worked through the land acknowledgement together. We're going to be looking at revisiting childhood stories, demonstrating a primary read aloud, a junior intermediate read aloud, tips for choosing books, where to find those books, and then other places you can find Indigenous story. So as we work through the session today, I'd like you to just think about these questions, and then also feel free to put things in the chat as they come to you. So thinking about what you remember learning about Indigenous peoples when you were in school, what Indigenous stories did you hear? And if you weren't born in Canada, when you came to Canada, were you introduced to Indigenous peoples and their stories? So we're going to start by sharing this book, Wild Berries by Julie Flett, who's an author and an illustrator. So this is a story about a young boy and his Okoma, his grandma, picking berries in the woods. So the focus for this read aloud would be looking at food sovereignty, gifts from Mother Earth, and building an understanding and new learning around where food comes from, beyond grocery stores and farms. So as we're reading the book, or before we would read the book, we would invite the children and the students, our children, to think about what they know about food, the food that they eat, where that food comes from, thinking about possible answers like the grocery store, corner store, food chairs, food banks, places like that. You're also going to want to invite them to think about other places that food might come from. And then as we're reading this story, you might take the chance to stop in between and say, remind them of some of the examples that they shared about places that they find food, and then invite them to think about, as we continue to read the book, think about Clarence and his grandma, and where are they? What are they doing? What are they looking for? And think about their connections to the land and to the food. And now we are going to listen to some of that story together. Give me a second. I have to stop sharing on that screen. It doesn't look like it's working for me. Let me try again. Robert, can you see the YouTube clip there, or is it just me?
I can see it.
Oh, you can. Okay, it's not showing for me. That's really strange.
I just can't hear it.
Yeah, it's not playing yet, so let me.
Wild Berries, Pikachi Minisa, by
Okay,
Julie
thanks.
Flett. When Clarence was little, his grandma carried him on her back through the woods to the clearing to pick wild berries, Pikachi Minisa. Grandma carried a bucket and sang. Now Clarence carries his own bucket and walks behind his grandma, Ukuma. They sing together. Blueberries dot the clearing. Grandma checks for bears. Musquack. They pick the plumpest berries they can find and drop them into their buckets. Otaski kawawa. Tup, tup. Grandma likes sweet blueberries. Inimina. Soft blueberries, juicy blueberries. Clarence likes big blueberries, sour blueberries, blueberries that go pop in his mouth. Clarence and his grandma pick blueberries for a long time. Punesk. They eat so many michet berries that their lips turn purple. An ant, Inik, crawls up Clarence's leg. Ch, ch, it tickles. A spider, Cucum minacesis, makes its web. Shh, shh. A fox, Magasis, sneaks by. Rustle, rustle. When the buckets are full, Clarence lays a handful of berries on a leaf for the birds, Binesisak, and the other animals of the woods. They say, "Thank you, Nenaskumawak." Clarence and his grandma walk back through the woods, Sakek, with their buckets full of berries. The birds sing, Nikamo, in the clearing. At the end of this wonderful book, there is a pronunciation guide. The words were actually taken from the Cree Plains Indians language.
So that's a really fantastic book. I see in the chat, it does talk about, someone mentioned infants and preschoolers. I've used this book all the way up to grade 6. I think using picture books in the older grades is a fantastic way to allow them to really dig deep into a particular book or a story because they are on the shorter side rather than a novel or even a graphic novel. You'll notice that at the end of the story, the reader did reference the Plains Cree, and he also used the word Indian, which is a word that should not necessarily, or sorry, it just shouldn't be used by folks that don't identify as Indigenous. So First Nations, Métis, Inuit. It's an outdated word, and it's a word that has often been used very pejoratively, so in a very negative way as a slur. So that was definitely something that to consider when you're reading with students. And we'll talk more about that later in the presentation around what to look for when you're choosing resources. And it is Cree, yes. So now I will share my screen again. Takes a second. There we go. So as you're reading the book and after you finish reading the book, this is a chance for you, I have no idea what happened there, to think about some questions you can ask your child after the reading. So things they noticed about the story, make connections back to the conversation you had with them before you started reading or while you were reading. One of the questions I often ask my students is inviting them to make the connection between taking berries for themselves and then also sharing berries with the animals, and that sort of reciprocity and that connection to the land and that thankfulness to the land, and also the concept of sharing and kindness. So some other resources that can support learning about the land and that respect for the land and just taking what's needed. OGBCon is a really great organization in Toronto, and they do a lot of land-based work with young children, including in the early years. Other picture books that you can use to connect to the land and respect for the land are A Walk on the Tundra and A Walk on the Shoreline, which are both by Rebecca Hainu. The First Strawberries, Fishing with Grandma is one of my favorite books. The Salmon Run, which is a great connection to the salmon run that happens in Toronto in the West End near Etienne Brûlé Park. Wild Eggs, Taking Care of Mother Earth, and The Three Sisters by Michelle Corneau, who's actually a TDSB administrator. A follow-up experience you can offer that's very play-based is creating a very simple coding grid. This particular coding grid, I used basic masking tape from Dollar Tree that I taped onto a table in my classroom, various loose parts, and then with the invitation or the question of how might you help Clarence and his Okoma grandma on their journey to the clearing.
Thanks, Adrienne. Marcy, that's Mitchif for thank you. So I'm going to look now at a book that's for grades 6 to 8 and also for early high school years. It's a series this one particularly is a girl called Echo. So they're a series, and this one particularly is called the Pemmican Wars. And the author is Katharina Vermette. Sorry, I'm a little tongue-tied this morning. I get a little nervous when I present, so that happens. So my apologies if I'm sounding a bit tongue-tied. I will do the best that I can to shake these nerves. It is a graphic novel. There are a series of graphic novels. So the main character is Echo Desjardins. She's a 13-year-old Métis girl. Some people that are Métis will call themselves Michif, which is the less colonial word. But she is struggling with her feelings of loneliness while separated from her mom and adjusting to a new school. Then one day, the history teacher, Mr. B, the history class turns into the extraordinary, and Echo's life will never be the same. Echo finds herself transported to another time and place. So what this series book does is it actually sort of teaches about the history of the Métis or the Michif through a graphic novel, but it's from a Métis perspective. So it offers a different perspective to history as opposed to one that might be told by a white settler. This particular one is a bison hut on the Saskatchewan prairie and back again to the present. So it goes from present time to historical time. She visits a Métis camp, travels the old fur trade routes, and experiences the perilous and bygone era of the Pemmican Wars. As an educator, I would use this to support and facilitate learning of students around Métis peoples, history, and identity, because it is written from that perspective. Adrian, can you go to the next, please? So while reading, here's some suggestions that I would offer, is that you and students and as caregivers and parents, that you're looking at details in the graphic novel panels to get clues about the historical setting and the contemporary setting. I'd also ask, what are some symbols that you're noticing? For example, we'll look at some in the, coming up in some of the illustrations. Ask if there's anything in the illustration that they recognize. Do they want to know more about? It's a great way to lead to inquiry and student-based inquiry. From the panels, ask questions and gather information on the historical and contemporary Métis communities, location, jobs, roles, clothing, resources, socioeconomic status, social and political systems, food, and modes of transportation. Can we go to the next one, Adrian? So as you see, it's set up in that comic style, but it's a graphic novel. So there's a lot of reading that happens through visually looking at the images and the illustrations, but then also through the text. And so what I see, for example, some of the things that I recognize is this looks like it's in a time from now. It's very contemporary, the way the students are dressed, the teachers dressed. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see sort of the rainbow flag. So a safe space for 2S LGBTQ students. But then right next to it is we see the Métis symbol. And so these are some things that students might recognize, that they might think about their own school context. And if not, it can lead to further conversation and questions. Can we go to the next one, please? And then we continue. I think what I like about the series too is it does speak to the different experiences of students in schools. It's very contemporary because you see a phone there. So there's a lot of symbols and things that students might recognize. I personally like the multi-dimensional characters. Does she have novels in French? She may have novels in French. A lot of things are available in French. If not, I would say you can still do it in English, because as French immersion, you can still do things in English and have the conversation in French. Can I go to the next one, please? Thank you. And then there's sort of this time travel that happens in the series. And so Echo gets to learn about the history of herself and her ancestors by going back and learning. And we see some learning that happens right directly on the land. What I like, again, as I mentioned, I do repeat myself. And when I do repeat myself, there's intentionality towards it, is that it is a wonderful experience to have someone write something from a Métis experience. It is not written from the white settler perspective. Can we go to the next one, Adrian? So after reading activities. So Adrian and I both sort of talk about this. You have your minds on. So when we're working with students in our beautiful reading, we always try to set up something before we get into the reading. We do our during reading activities, and then there's always that after reading activity to extend the learning, and students engage in that inquiry and learning. So, there's those, we call them sort of, this is an older way of doing things in literacy, but it's sort of that retell, relate, reflect. And so asking your child, what's the story about? How would they tell it in their own words? Talk about if there's anything that they're curious about, what do they want to learn more about? Tell stories from their own life. So I know sometimes, and it is a good thing when people worry about cultural appropriation. I always say, if you're going to engage your own child or students in some art activities, is that they draw upon their own experiences. So students aren't going to go, or your children are not going to sort of try to illustrate the Echo's life. What they're going to do is talk about their own experiences, write about their own experiences, draw or paint, collage their own. As well, you can learn more about the history of Métis people through the Métis Nation of Ontario. They have a lot of teacher resources that are very friendly for parents and caregivers to use as well. Can we go to the next one, Adrian?
Thanks, Robert. So now I'm going to invite folks to think about what some of the things are that you might consider when you're choosing an Indigenous text for your classroom, your students, your children, your nieces, nephews, anybody that you care about in your family. And just if we could pop a few ideas in the chat, that would be great. And I will find the link for you for the 7 teaching stories. If you go to Good Minds and you search 7 teaching stories, they'll come up in English and French, and there's also a teacher's guide. Age appropriate for sure. All right. So personally, when I'm looking at books to add to our collection and to share with schools, I'm looking for whether or not the book has been written, and in most cases also illustrated by an Indigenous person. We often talk about, so we talk about authentic resources, and it shouldn't be a non-Indigenous person writing about Indigenous stories. That's not an authentic resource. You're going to want to look at the terminology that's being used in the book. So we briefly mentioned that earlier. So you're looking at proper terminology, as specific as possible. So if you know the nation or community that the character is from, we want to see that used in the book. You're going to want to avoid books that include terminology like Aboriginal and Indian. Those are terms that should not be used in literature anymore. They're very outdated. Aboriginal is a word that I still see used more commonly than Indian. The Indian is a word that should only be used in reference to legal documents, so something like the Indian Act. Otherwise, terminology should be First Nation, Métis, Inuit, or referencing specific nations and communities like Mi'kmaq, Cree, Métis, Serpent River would be an example of a community that you might see referenced in a book. And then are the characters who identify as Indigenous portrayed in a positive way? You want to be very mindful that you're not choosing only resources that focus on trauma and challenge and struggle. You also want to look at resources that demonstrate the brilliance, the joy, the futurism of Indigenous peoples, and also not just historical perspectives, but also current perspectives, which is mentioned in 62 and 63 in the TRC calls to action around residential school curriculum as well. It's an important thing for everyone to learn about, but it's not the only thing folks should learn about. And then looking at the images and illustrations, we've seen some really strange things in books in terms of how the characters are depicted. some really offensive and some just silly. So you definitely want to be looking, and that's also why the illustrator is so important. You want to be looking for books, resources where the things are current, and where we're not represented in a caricature style wearing like buckskin and feathers. Like that's not the image you want to leave your students with, but it's something that we see very often, or your children. And then the next one I have, so where can you find some really great books? So Good Minds is an Indigenous owned company that we source a lot of our titles from. They're very good. They're really great about answering questions. If you're looking for something specific, they are very responsive to email. And the person who buys their books for them and chooses their books for them is very well versed in what's current and what's appropriate. So they're definitely a go-to resource for us. You can find a lot of really great Indigenous picture books at the Toronto Public Library. But again, you're going to want to be mindful of the things I mentioned in the previous slide about what to look for, because they do carry some books that are a bit older and maybe a bit outdated. There's also the Toronto Public Library Dial a Story. We have TDSB external resources where you can source books. And then if you have a child or you're an educator in the board, you have access to the TDSB's professional library collection using either your employee number or a student number. And we've worked really hard with the library to source and provide a lot of really great high quality Indigenous authored books, not just picture books, as ebooks, which you can access at home or virtually with students and with your children.
Merci, Adrian. And so picture books, of course, and novels and graphic novels are beautiful ways to engage in learning with students and your children. But also, there are some beautiful things that we can access through the National Film Board or the NFB. There are a number of works made by Indigenous peoples and Indigenous artists that are able to share and look at freely. Now for TDSB and teachers, if there's something that you want to see in NFB that requires a login, we do have that, and that can be accessed. But a lot of the short films that are for children are all accessible for free on the NFB. And I think what we'll do is we'll have a moment to look at one of these shorts right now, just so we can look at some of the beautiful works that are available for us to share with our younger people and our learners. So are you able to share one of the videos, Adrian?
I'm going to try.
Thank you.
I'm going to see if this works. It's not working. Let me try. Ooh. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to try and use my laptop. Just give me 1 second.
what I love about this particular short that we saw is it's beautifully illustrated, but also it allows students to ask questions. And then as a parent, caregiver, teacher, educator, is it allows an opportunity to say, oh, I want to learn more about that story. I want to see the words to that story. What I think about though is there's some beautiful illustration in that. And I think about how might I tell my own story. So if I'm me as the educator or working with students, how might I illustrate my own story? Or what are stories from my own background or culture that I might want to illustrate and tell stories without words? So there's a lot of beautiful activities that go along with it. Can we go to the next one, Adrian? Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Sorry, so some other really great junior intermediate titles that you may want to consider are the Mighty Muskrat series, which is a really great current series. The third book just came out, and I believe that that series will continue with some more books. The Mothers of Zan series, which is a really great way to make connections to the land and science and food. So there are 6 titles out now, I believe. And then another really fantastic one is the Misway Saga by David Robertson. So The Barren Grounds and The Great Bear are books 1 and 2. The Great Bear just got released in the last couple of weeks. And if you're an intermediate TDSB staff member, we have a session with Dave looking at The Great Bear in November as part of our Indigenous Education Month planning. And then there's a link there for a grade K-8 book list that has a variety of titles. And then if you're looking for something for yourself to do some learning and unlearning on your own as a parent and or educator caregiver, definitely take a look at Indigenous Rights by Chelsea Bowell. It's a really great book with a collection of 31 essays talking about highlighting, addressing different contemporary issues faced by Indigenous peoples within Canada. And she's a Métis lawyer from out west. And we say thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions, we're happy to answer them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to drop the link for that book list into the chat. And I will also try to find the listing for the 7 teaching stories in French from Good Minds. And I'll drop those in the chat as well.
Merci, Adrian, and thank you everyone for joining us. So if you have any questions at this point, we can sit here and chat with you a bit.
Hi, Robert.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Durward Anthony from TDSB. I'm the nutrition person.
Okay.
Okay. I got, one of my questions is I've worked with First Nations way back in the day. And
yep. And you met with my colleague Ixchel a few weeks ago.
Absolutely, yes. You were supposed to be there. Yeah. I would definitely love to continue that particular meeting because there's so much to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And I really feel, even if to learn other languages, let's face it, Robert, right now, I could say to you, La Pam, you know what it is. Or I could say hasta la vista or whatever, people will understand. But as an educator, would people know what miigwech is or ane, those particular words? So, by using something like, using food as a way of learning another language, whether it's in Ojibwe, as an example, or in Cree, and tie that more to a nutrition program and to expand people's knowledge base of the language and the culture and where it comes from,
mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, and actually, what I found was that the beginning of the video, I noticed there was a whale there. And one of the things that came up, I asked myself, is that an orca or is that a bowhead whale? And I came to the conclusion that, most people don't even know what a bowhead is. But they're, they're the giants of the North. A story needs to be told. There's so much story that needs to be told there. Just one little clip. Mm-hmm. So that's all I want to say. I don't want to take up, much of the time and conversation, but we'll definitely be in touch.
Thank you. And that's what I liked about that video is what I would say is that would just be like, I think in the primary grades, like grade 2 and 3 is like, what kind of questions might they come up with around, is that an orca? What kind of whale is that? Mm-hmm. Because then you start to question, well, the Mi'kmaq, what part of Turtle Island do the Mi'kmaq live on? And
exactly,
I think it leads to a lot of great questions.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there any more questions? Maria, I think you said you had one question. Did you want to put it in the chat, or did you want to?
Yes, I typed it. It's just I just wanted to check because even though I use Première Nation, Métis, Inuit, I have used the word autochtone, and I'm wondering if autochtone is correct because Adrienne just mentioned, Aboriginal, not to use the word Aboriginal, for example, use the word Indigenous. And I just wanted to get clarification on the word autochtone.
So in French now, we're still using autochtone.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to check. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking. All right, everyone, thank you for coming out. Enjoy the rest of the day, enjoy the rest of the sessions. And it's always beautiful to be with people and continue our learning. So
thanks, everyone. I just dropped the new link to that book list in the chat. I'm not sure why it's not working.
Thanks, I see it.
Perfect. Let me know if that one doesn't work out also, and then you can send me an email and I'll send it to you that way.
It absolutely works. I just
perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day. You're welcome. Thank you.
The link works now. Thank you so much.